By the time Arlen turned 19, the world had already taught him how to live out of a backpack. He carried it like a second spine, tent in one sleeve, coil of nylon rope stowed in the other, a tin cup hooked to a carabiner like a bell that only rang for rivers. The pack also kept a folded map that behaved as if it had lungs. Even when no wind moved, the paper flexed the way a sleeping animal does. A slow rise and fall that made strangers glance twice and then decide, kindly, that they had imagined it. The map was the last thing his father gave him before disappearing into a winter storm 10 years ago. It wasn't inked so much as etched. Hair-thin lines where coastlines should be, little scars where cities might go. Notations in a script that looked older than the languages Arlen picked up working ferry docks and market stalls. In certain light, if you tilted your head and believed in impossible angles, the map seemed to hold depth, as if the paper had remembered the mountains it depicted and refused to be flat. Arlen had been moving for 2 years, crossing borders the way some people crossed streets. He hiked volcanic spines in the Azores. He ate noodles on a plastic stool while warm rain made music on corrugated roofs. He slept in a monastery hostel where someone's snoring aligned with the creak of the building and made the night sound like an old ship. He was not running. He was following a rumor that the treasure his father had spent a decade chasing was not coins or jewels but something left behind by people who understood the earth as both machine and animal. The map warmed when he was close. It began with a city of stone stacked along a fjord, where the water wore the sky like a coat. Arlen busked with a cheap tin whistle for 3 evenings and made enough to buy a pair of boots that didn't pretend to be waterproof. Then he took a midnight ferry north. The map shivered against his palm as the boat threaded black islands. By dawn, he climbed onto a dock that smelled like old rope and new fish. On the cliffs above, a lighthouse looked like a knuckle punched through fog. He found her in the lighthouse, a woman named Isla who could take apart a radio with a butter knife and put it back together with a pen. She had sea-gray eyes and the habit of pointing with her whole body. "Your map breathes," she said without preamble, because she didn't have room for small talk with storms to read and ships to shepherd. "Either it's some sort of flexing vellum or we are standing too near a truth." "Both things can be true," Arlen said, glad he had practiced sounding older than his face. She snorted. "What are you chasing?" "A place," he said. "A vault," my father thought. He called it a chest. He also called it a hinge. And a cradle. He wasn't good at committing to single nouns. "Where does the map say?" He spread the paper on the work table, careful not to let the ocean's breath make a policy of it. The etched lines blurred, then gathered themselves. A spiral rose where mountains should have been. A glacier at the northern edge of the world. Around it, the markings read, halo, cartilage, door, a vault under ice? Isla said, unimpressed. People who hide things under ice are optimists. Or very tired, Arlen said. They left at dawn in a borrowed truck with a windshield that held a spiderweb of old mistakes. Past the last town, the road became an idea the landscape had consented to, reluctantly. Snow began. It didn't fall, it arranged itself. By the second hour the world had narrowed to a tunnel of gust, with the truck a stubborn bead threading itself forward. Arlen stole glances at the map. The lines began to glow the way lichen does when a flashlight finds it. At a bend where the road gave up and a white plane took over, Isla stopped. "The last time I made a choice like this," she said, "it ended with me eating cold beans beside a broken skidoo and promising the sky I would no longer insult it." "I can go alone," Arlen said, because stubbornness felt like honesty. She laughed without smiling. What would be the point of me telling you not to die if I let you practice first? They strapped on snowshoes. The ice sang under their feet. Those deep wail notes you can feel in your stomach. The map hummed against Arlen's ribs. The world was white, 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 and then, at the rim of a low depression, the white split into a blue so clear it made his teeth ache. A moulin. A throat cut into the glacier, a vertical river swallowed whole. Arlen crouched, breath fogging the air, and felt the map get hotter. Please do not suggest we go into that, Isla said conversationally. I wasn't going to suggest, Arlen said. I was going to apologize in advance. They rigged the rope to a bollard of frozen wind. Arlen clipped in and leaned backward into sky. He had climbed in quarries and in churches and on roofs that were tired of being roofs, but none of those had looked like this. Blue walls lit from within, an ancient cathedral built of winter, the sound of water writing a love letter to gravity. Halfway down, a draft rose like a breath from the world's mouth. The map, zipped inside his jacket, vibrated like a struck tuning fork. When his boots hit ice, the echo came from below, a chamber where the river widened into a black underworld lake. The beam of his headlamp found the far wall, and what was not wall at all. A shape under ice, geometric and wrong. Nothing natural makes six-sided corners that precise. The ice entombed something like a stone chest the size of a car, its face carved with a tessellation of shallow bowls and lines that reminded Arlen of capillaries. On its lid, a symbol repeated. A circle divided not in halves but in spirals, like a hurricane drawn by hand. Isla arrived in a fountain of curses that steamed the air. She shone her lamp and sighed in the voice of someone who has just met her destiny on an inconvenient day. Well, that's not trying to be subtle, is it? Arlen's breath fogged her beam. He lifted his hand. Heat radiated from the ice, at odds with reason. Maybe the geometry bled warmth, or the river spoke in temperatures, or his own excitement set his skin alight. He pressed his palm against the glassy wall. The map behind his ribs went from warm to hot to almost pain. The ice cracked. Not dramatically, there was no cinematic shatter. It was the tiny sound a book makes when you bend it open for the first time in years. The crack laced across the face of the glacier-embedded chest and stopped at the edge of one carved bowl. Arlen pulled his glove with his teeth. He set his bare hand into the bowl, and a notch fit a scar on his palm he hadn't known was a key. The lid lifted itself. No hinges moved. The ice did not drip. The stone did not scrape. One moment the chest wore a lid and the next it wore an absence. Inside lay a disc the color of tarnished silver, veined with a lighter metal in spirals. It looked like a god's forgotten coins melted into one. Arlen's father's map, through 2 layers of clothing, beat a faint second pulse. Don't, Isla said, which is the word the world says to every story at the moment it tips. Arlen lifted the disc. The first thing he noticed was the absence of friction. It came up like a platter on invisible hands. The second was the sound. Not a bell, not a hum, something like pressure changing in a distant room. The third was not noticed but understood. A wordless message from the part of the brain that relaxes only when the stove checks back in with silence. It said, "You have opened a sealed system." A wind rose. The headlamp beams guttered and steadied. The ice above them sang a higher note, the kind of frequency that makes tools misbehave. Isla's hand found his sleeve and closed like a knot. "We need to go," she said, but the need arrived late. The map convulsed under his jacket. Somewhere miles above, the sky must have been altering its plans. They climbed. The rope burned his palms through gloves that should have been sufficient. Arlen did not look down, because looking down belongs to different stories. They burst out of the Moulin into a world that had reorganized. Snow didn't fall, it blew upward, a white fountain reversed. The horizon had tipped, or his stomach had decided it was tired of being polite. On the far ridge, a slab of ice calved from nothing Arlen could name and slid on a cushion of air. He heard, felt, the sound hit some slow register and roll out across the plain. They ran through a sky that wanted to be ground. When they reached the truck, Isla threw the door open and then shut it on the wind's hand. The engine turned over like a stubborn man deciding to be helpful. They drove into white that had become a pack animal. "Explain," Isla said, which was fair. Arlen pulled the map from his jacket. It lay on his knees and shivered like a living thing trying to shed water. The etched lines changed as he watched. A ring that had sat quiet at the center spread, thin as a hair, to circle the entire map. Tiny points lit at the ring's edges, there, and there, and there, as if someone had pricked paper with a needle and pushed fire through. "I think it was sealed for a reason," he said, voice thin with a hard kind of awe. "I think it held pressure. Or balance. Or a promise." Isla kept the truck between ditches by faith and calculation. "A promise with what?" "Not with what," Arlen said. "With everything." They hit the coast a day later through wind that had frosted the world's edges. At the first village with a satellite dish held together by rope, they found a cafe whose television had learned to shout in several languages at once. A crawl of text moved under a parade of images that looked like they had been drawn by someone with talent and a hatred for ease. A forest in Indonesia burned not from one place but from a circle of places, trees torching as if lit by an invisible ring that walked with a purpose. A city in North Africa woke to a horizon black with locusts in geometric shapes, the insects routing themselves in spirals and polygons as if obeying a draft. A Gulf Stream buoy reported temperature swings like a fever chart, hours hot then cold then hot again, while fish threw themselves out of the water in silver commas and lay baffled on beaches. Under the Pacific, a tremor rolled not along a fault line but along a curve no geologist had drawn. Sirens spoke in coastlines. Isla's hand found the remote and stilled it. Silence arrived the way an elevator does, after a delay spent somewhere else. In the quiet, Arlen could hear the map rustle. He imagined comedic explanations. The map is possessed by a cat. The paper is reacting to sugar in the air. But they withered under the news creeping letter by letter. Unprecedented, anomalous, spiral propagation. "Turn it back on," he said. "What good will it do?" Isla asked, but she clicked anyway, because some people are decent by reflex. A scientist with eyebrows like short winter grasses stood in front of a graphic and tried to lend dignity to horror by naming it. He pointed to an animated ring expanding across a projection of the globe. "We're seeing what looks like a release of energy along a non-tectonic spiral fault," he said. There isn't language for this. The signal is coherent. It's as if someone cut a careful seam and the planet is exhaling. Arlen folded the map and slipped it back into his jacket like a contraband animal. The edges whispered against the zipper. It felt, treacherously, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. "What did you take?" Isla asked softly. He pulled the disc from his pack and laid it on the cafe table. The air above it trembled the way road air does in desert heat. Up close, the veined metal lines were not lines but micro-etched channels. Tiny letters ran along them, letters too small to read without magnification but which his skin recognized in the old-fashioned way. not by comprehension, but by thrum. Something that was holding a line, he said. And I broke it. He had expected accusation, or panic, or the particular fury of people who now had a new noun at which to throw stones. Isla only looked tired. Then we put it back, she said. Or we find the other end of whatever it belongs to and ask if it wants to stop being angry. The cafe door opened and let in a wedge of air that smelled like salt, diesel, and the first page of a difficult book. A fisherman in a sweater that had committed to being one color a decade ago glanced at the television, then at the disc, then at Arlen's face, and, because older stories had prepared him for this, nodded once. Storm's wrong, he said. Sea's rolling like a thing that's lost its prayer. If you've got a plan that isn't confess and drown, I'll drive. Arlen closed his hand over the disc. It was warmer than his palm. The map under his jacket shifted like a creature turning in sleep. I have a place to start, he said. The ring on the map, those pricked points. They're waking. If what I opened was one part of a system, then the others will be answering. If we can reach them, if we can close them, maybe the ring stops walking. Isla drew the map with her finger on the table, tracing the arc that had no business being an arc. Where's the closest point that lit? Arlen unfolded the map again. One tiny ember burned in the margin of a drawn desert, near mountains that, in the right light, looked like teeth. The notation there, in the map's mirage script, changed as he watched, letters tilting into something his mind suddenly agreed to hear. Gate of Dry Thunder. I think the next place that will shout, he said. The fisherman, Tane, as it turned out, shrugged into his coat as if it were armor. Maps are for people who admit they don't know where they are, he said. I like you already. Outside, the sky rehearsed new colors that didn't suit it. The wind had learned to go in circles. Somewhere under the cafe floor, the ground did something geological and petty. Arlen felt like someone who had pulled a thread from an old sweater and then watched the sleeve fall off. Isla set her hand on his shoulder. She wore a practical expression, which is the hardest kind of kindness. We move, she said. You lead. If we need to be sorry, we will do it later and often. For now, be useful. The map pulsed once, and all three of them felt it. The way you feel a bass note in your ribs. Arlen tucked the disc into its wrapper, zipped the pocket, and stood. He was scared enough to be honest. He was certain enough to be worth following. He was neither prophet nor thief nor hero. He was a boy who had traveled a long time and found a treasure that had mislabeled itself, and then he did what people have always done when the world required them to change shape. He took a breath and stepped into it. They drove south toward dry country under a sky that had begun to count wrong. In the back seat, Arlen anchored the disc under his palm and felt vibration run through his bones in a pattern that was almost language. He did not know yet what it said. He would learn. For now, he could name only the direction of the next of the waking points. The world shivered as if remembering something painful. And somewhere far behind them, under a cathedral of blue ice, a lid that had never been hinged considered, briefly, the idea of closing again, and did not. The road south was a scar across the earth, stitched and restitched by asphalt that couldn't quite persuade the desert to behave. The farther they drove, the stranger the sky became. Clouds moved in circles, not lines, stacking like coins tossed into a fountain. Twice, sandstorms started in silence and collapsed just as suddenly, as if someone had pulled a cord and unplugged them. Arlen sat in the back of the borrowed truck with the disc on his knees. Wrapped in a blanket, it still managed to hum, a low vibration that crawled into his bones. Each hour the pattern shifted, sometimes steady, sometimes syncopated, like a heartbeat trying out new rhythms. Isla kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on the radio, twisting dials through static and interrupted broadcasts. Record heat waves striking simultaneously. Arctic feedback loops, experts say spiral symmetry, repeating anomaly. The phrases blurred together, but the shape of the news was clear. Whatever balance the disk had been part of, it was gone now. By the second night, they reached the plateau the map called Gate of Dry Thunder. It was a place where stone fangs bit up through the desert, black rock littered with old carvings and newer bullet holes. Lightning flared on the horizon, but there were no clouds, only a dry crack of light across a sky too clear to deserve it. "That's not right," Isla said softly. "Lightning without a storm? That's nerves firing in the body of the world." Tane, the fisherman who had insisted on coming because you don't set a net and walk away from it, spat into the dust. "Looks like a mouth to me. A mouth that forgot what it was chewing." Arlen spread the breathing map on the hood of the truck. The lines shifted, as they always did, but now the spiral ring pulsed with a brighter glow. At its edge, here in this desert, a point burned like a coal. As they watched, faint threads extended outward from the point, curling into shapes that almost resembled letters. "It's calling," Arlen murmured. "Or warning," Isla corrected. They climbed the ridge at dawn. The rock was slick with desert varnish, black glass etched by centuries of wind. At the summit they found what the map had promised. A circle of stones as tall as men, arranged with the kind of precision that made accidents blush. In the center lay a shallow depression carved with spirals, the same spiral that decorated the glacier chest. The disc in Arlen's pack began to pulse harder, as if trying to leap free. "Whatever you do," Isla said, "don't just." Arlen knelt and set the disc into the spiral. The ground roared. Not cracked, not shook, roared. A vibration ran outward in concentric rings. Dust lifted off the ground in floating sheets. The sky answered with another bolt of dry lightning, striking the horizon and crawling across it like a living vein. The stones glowed from within, inscriptions flaring that had not seen light in centuries. "Too late for cautions," Tane muttered. The disk melted into the rock. Not vanished, melted, like a key returning to its lock. The spiral depression filled with light that wasn't fire or electricity but something older, some energy that carried memory with it. Arlen's chest seized. He wasn't breathing desert air anymore, he was seeing. He saw builders older than cities, carving stone with gestures instead of tools. He saw them place discs like his into circles around the world, each one a knot in a net that held the earth's tremors in rhythm. He saw storms rise, ready to devour, and then collapse when the net absorbed their fury. He saw centuries of balance. And then, he saw one disc stolen. His disc. A seam left open, a rhythm broken. Arlen staggered back, gasping, vision shattered. "What did you see?" Isla demanded, gripping his shoulders. "A system," he said hoarsely. "They built, not treasure. Not a weapon. A balance. The discs are anchors. I pulled one out, and the rhythm fell apart." Tane looked out over the desert where lightning crawled endlessly across a blue sky. "So we put them back." Arlen shook his head. "It's not that simple. The glacier chest, it wasn't just holding the disc. It was sealed. Sealed for good. Something made them shut it down." "Then why did it answer you?" Isla asked. Arlen had no answer. That night they camped among the stones, wary of the way the air kept trembling like a plucked string. Arlen dreamed of spirals. In the dream his father stood at the edge of a great abyss, map in hand, pointing at the stars. Not treasure, boy, his father said. A hinge. Open it wrong, and the door swings both ways. Arlen woke with his heart racing. He looked at the stones, still faintly glowing, and felt the weight of what he had undone. They traveled on. The map pointed them next to the sea, to another ember glowing at the edge of the spiral. The journey stretched into weeks. Along the way they passed towns already unraveling, crops blackened overnight, rivers running backward for hours at a time, animals migrating in geometric herds. At each place people asked for explanations, for hope, for answers Arlen didn't have. He only had the map and the growing certainty that each point was waking in sequence. Each time, the same rhythm played, a deep vibration, the earth exhaling in spirals, the balance tipping further. At the third point, on an island where cliffs knifed into the sea, they found another circle of stones half buried in surf. The disk that had melted into the desert spiral did not return, it had been absorbed. But when Arlen knelt at the water's edge, the map pulsed again. This time, the sea responded directly, currents circling inward, whirlpools forming, waves slamming themselves against the rocks as if trying to climb. Stop, Isla shouted. She dragged him back. You're feeding it. Arlen's head rang with visions again. Storms centuries ago, earthquakes flattened before they began, disasters erased before they had names. But also, a flaw. The system needed constant balance, constant vigilance. If left unchecked too long, the energy stored could shatter everything instead of saving it. And it had been left unchecked too long. By the time they reached the coast again, the news spoke with only one vocabulary: catastrophe. A spiral cyclone the size of a continent hovered over the Atlantic, unmoving. Volcanoes along the Pacific Rim fired in sequence, one after another, as though a drummer kept beat. Rivers boiled in places, cities drowned in others, and the map still pulsed. Arlen sat in the truck staring at it. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. It's not waking one at a time anymore, he said. They're all waking, all at once. Then we hurry, Isla said grimly. Tane glanced at the sky, where lightning wrote spirals against the stars. Or we confess, he muttered. Arlen closed the map. His father's voice in the dream still echoed. Open it wrong, and the door swings both ways. Somewhere, in the spiral's center, something was waiting. And the world was running out of time. By the fourth week the world had learned a new sound. A low, circular thunder that threaded itself through wind and traffic and the private noises of kitchens. People said they could feel it in their fillings. Dogs woke at night and stared at corners. Rivers forgot the arithmetic of downhill. The news ran out of adjectives and began to borrow from music, oscillation, resonance, overtone, as if naming could tune it. The map would not lie still. Even folded, it wriggled against Arlen's chest like a bird insisting on sky. When he finally let it breathe on the truck's tailgate, the thin spiral ring around the world brightened until the etched lines looked backlit. More of the little pricked embers were awake now, pulsing at the ring's edge in time with the thunder that wasn't thunder. In the middle of the spiral, where cartographers put "here be dragons" when they mean we don't know, something glowed that hadn't glowed before. A soft, stubborn light like a coal refusing rain. Center, Isla said, and Arlen heard relief in the word as well as dread. People who fix things love a source. The map's hand-me-down script shifted. Letters bent into a phrase his mind accepted on the second try, umbilicus mare. Below it, another, in a thinner hand, axis of breath. Tane shaded his eyes and looked past the truck hood as if he might catch sight of the place from land. Middle of the spinning, he said. Sargasso, Calm if the winds pity you, death if they don't. I can get us to a place sailors avoid by habit. Isla drew the circle with a knuckle on the map. It's an ocean gyre. Quiet in the way a pause in a fight is quiet. She flicked her gaze at Arlen. If your keystone lives in water, we'll need more than rope and apologies. They drove to a coast that had forgotten how to be the coast it was yesterday and persuaded a harbor master to forget rules in exchange for remembering decency. Tane's friend loaned them a longliner built like a shrug. Not built for the camera, built to live. She was named Hearthwind, a name that sounded like someone wanted a home and storm in the same sentence. The sky went complicated as they cleared the breakwater. Storms stitched themselves like thoughts you can't quit. Twice lightning crawled across clear sky, a bright root system overweight with secrets. The sea came at them cross-grained, then smooth, then cross again, as if rehearsing possibilities. The Hearthwind took it the way a good chair takes a child's fidgeting, grumbling only to remind it has standards. Arlen slept in the forward bunk with the disk's ghost humming in his bones. He dreamed the architects again, those careful people with hands that made stone prefer curves and circles to corners. They stood around a map carved into the floor of a chamber with no right angles. He understood, without being told, that the room was undersea and older than the need to measure age. A woman with hair like kelp pinned by bronze combs pressed her palm into a dish tiled with little bowls. "Breath out, breath in," she said in a language he didn't have and still knew. "Measure what the world cannot refuse to do." "Why did you seal the glacier chest?" Arlen asked, surprising himself by hearing his own voice inside the dream. The woman's mouth kinked, sad and proud at once. "Because we were tired," she said, which sounded like old. "Because we lost 2 keepers in 1 turning. Because even machines that cradle mercy break if you ask them to hold everything alone." Arlen woke with his hand flat on the bunk, fingers splayed as if over a small constellation of bowls. The Hearthwind rolled and steadied. On deck, Tane and Isla were already arguing in the generous way of people who trust each other's competence. "Wind's been on 3 sides of us and none of them right," Tane said, testing a knot with the bored affection of a man who respects rope more than most politicians. "Gyre's throwing its weight." Isla had the radio open and a burner soldering iron between her teeth. "If we lose comms inside the eye, we still need something that speaks loud. I can turn the ship's horn into a tone generator if I bully it." "What tone?" Tane asked. She glanced at Arlen. "Whatever his map is singing. You hear it?" Arlen swallowed. The hum that had followed him for days had gathered into a pattern that made his skin prickle. It was not melody, not in any tradition he knew, but there were intervals, returns, a shape. 7 pulses, a rest, 3 pulses, a longer rest. Then a sweep outward through a scale no one had written down, returning like a tide to the place it began. "I think it wants call and response," he said. "Like whales. Or prayer." "Prayers are just physics with manners," Tane said. "Point me at your god." The world's maps show the Sargasso as blank and calm, comforting people who like their dangers to hustle and their water to commit theatrically. In truth, the gyre moved them inward on slides and sly hands, the sea's face moving in curves wider than countries. The farther they went, the quieter the wind sounded and the louder the low circular thunder folded into their ribs. Weed gathered. Rafts of sargassum with crabs playing shy and fish solving mazes under bronze leaves. Plastic, too, honest and terrible, faded crates, a bright blue bucket that had earned retirement and not gotten it, a doll's head looking thoughtful. Tane threaded the longliner through it with curses that made the weed part respectfully. "Feels like a great sleeping thing," he muttered, and is scratching its back with a knitting needle. The map got hot enough to sting. Arlen held it by the corners and watched the center glow intensify. Beneath their keel the water changed color. The flashy blue of postcards fell away to something darker, a near purple that made his stomach remember deep places. On the sonar Isla had coaxed back from sulk to usefulness, the bottom quit. The screen showed a hole, a drop, a throat. "Blue hole," Isla said softly. "A sink into limestone that forgot the roof." She switched the set from depth to tone and winced. "And the whole damn basin is singing." They came into the eye at dusk, when the horizon is a polished coin and the sun, briefly, remembers restraint. The storm ringed them in a standing wall, a white stadium with a roof of cloud pressing its palms together. Inside, the water lay almost flat, except for the breath. Even before they killed the engine, the sea lifted under them and relaxed again, regular as a sleeping chest. "Axis," Tane said. "You brought us to the navel." Arlen spread the map on the deck. The center coal brightened until the etched lines failed to contain it. Light bled into wood. Isla squinted toward the hole. "You're not taking that thing down there alone." "I wasn't going to suggest alone," Arlen said. "I was going to ask you to yell at the sky in a key it recognizes." She grinned despite the hour. "Finally, something I was born to do." They anchored on 3 points, not to hold the boat. The sea would decide that. But to persuade her not to argue while the work happened. Tane checked the lines, then checked them again. "I'll keep her nose where she should be and her bum out of trouble," he said. "If something comes up from that throat that isn't water, I'll hit it with the boat and call it seamanship." Arlen and Isla clipped on rope and light. The water met them with elegant cold. 10 feet down, sound changed. 20 feet down, it became the only thing that mattered. The axis sang into their bodies through bone, the way a mother's voice does for ears not yet assigned to a child. The throat widened into a room. Light from their torches glanced off walls of smooth, old stone, not limestone after all, but something laid by hands and made to look like geology. A ring stood on the floor, waist high, hollow, carved with little bowls like stars. Arlen's scar ached like weather. He swam to the ring and hovered, heart trying to take over conversation from lungs. Here was the thing from his dreams. The match to the glacier's chest. The sister to the desert's spiral. Only this one had no disk, just an absence shaped like one. Isla's hand touched his shoulder. Bubbles fled her mask when she raised her eyebrows. "Well?" Arlen set his palm into the arrangement of bowls. The fit was exact in a way that felt less like destiny than like being seen properly for the first time. Heat went into him, and out of him, and then into him again. The song in his bones found counterpoint, then insistence, then need. Around them, the wall inscriptions flared, went out, flared again. Isla turned and pointed upward, the signal that means air matters more than ideas. Arlen nodded, counted, pulled his hand free. The song yanked at him, finish, but he went because the ocean insists on not being outreasoned. They surfaced into a world waiting to know whether it would continue. On deck, Tane had the horns cover off and a nest of wires growing under Isla's hasty genius. She stripped her mask, spit out the regulator, and went for the soldering iron like a surgeon pulled from bed by a gallbladder. "I can make it sing your 7 pulses," she said, fingers quick. "If the axis wants call and response, let's give it the loudest hymn at sea." Arlen sat with the map and placed his hand over the center glow. The burn eased when his scar touched paper. The pattern that had been harrying him clarified. 7, rest, 3, rest, sweep, and he counted it until his jaw remembered how to count. He said it aloud and Isla tuned the horn to it, one resistor at a time. Tane stood at the wheel with his eyes on the throat and his knuckles saying they would not accept any further foolishness from the sea. When she flipped the switch and hit the horn, the note climbed into the wall of storm and didn't come back. It went down instead. The hearthwind shuddered. In the deep, something answered. Not echo, conversation. The axis sang back with the weight of a planet. 7 pulses, a breath, 3 pulses, a longer breath. The sweep, then a question in the shape of silence. Arlen looked at the ring of bulls under his skin. He closed his eyes and saw the other gates. The desert ring still warm with his disk. The cliff circle in surf still stubborn in its half-burial. The glacier chest open to blue cold and wrong. He felt the energy thrumming around the earth like a belt. He understood the mistake. It was not that he had removed a weight from a system and left it lighter. It was that he had unlatched the drum that held the rhythm. The network hadn't failed, it had been paused. When he lifted the disk, it started again after a patient age, and found no keeper ready to count. I can't plug it, he said softly. I have to conduct it. Isla's head tilted, practical mind making room for this metaphysics because physics had already made the room. You're saying the system needs a human metronome. Not just human, tuned. He touched his scar. My father took me to the glacier when I was 9. I remember the cold and the blue in him telling me to be brave and then, nothing. But the marks there, the bowls fit. His breath shook. He found steadiness in the ship's wood beneath him. He keyed me and sealed it when they gave up. I opened it now because it recognized me as the next. He struggled for a word that didn't make him feel ridiculous or holy. Hand. Tane set the wheel lock with the care of a man placing a baby on a pillow. He came and crouched, the deck creaking in sympathy with his knees. You're thinking this will take more than a horn. It will take, living here. For a while. Arlen swallowed. A year. A decade. I don't know. Long enough to teach the world to breathe by the old count again. Long enough to find others who can hold time if I drop it. Isla stared at him for a long, unsentimental 15 seconds. Then we don't leave you here alone, she said. And we don't make you the only clock. Redundancy saves lives. That's not how myths do it, Arlen said, and hated himself for wanting the glamour of martyrdom when what the world required was logistics. Good, Isla said briskly. Myths are lazy with maintenance. She jabbed a thumb at the horn. I can automate the call, but we'll need to retune it as the axis relaxes. We can build buoys, Tane? He had already stood and was looking at the sargassum rafts like a man measuring timber with his eye. I know 6 captains who would set a line of cans if it meant fewer boats swallowed by sins that aren't theirs, he said. We can triangulate the rhythm with foghorns and bells. And I can hold you on station while you pray. Arlen laughed once, breathless. We're going to fix the world with boat horns and a used soldering iron. And a boy who keeps time, Tane said gently. They worked, because work is what belief looks like when you mean it. Isla wrote code in a shipping ledger and taped it inside the radio set. Tane turned the hearthwind into a quiet machine that didn't argue with the lift and fall. Arlen ducked below, took the little bulls under his hand again, and learned the pulse well enough to count it inside a dream. When he laid his palm to the ring a second time, the axis took more of him. Vision thrummed beyond sight. He saw the ring of world gates like a necklace around a throat, lights flaring at each in time with his hand. He felt energy stored in storms and quakes being routed and bled, not into disaster but into movement. Long slow currents sped, jet stream braided, the aurora swollen like a bruise but gentle. He began the call, 7-3, sweep, and the axis answered and then, astonishingly, allowed him to lead. Not a machine, then, but a partner. A dancer who would follow if you proved you knew the step. He lost track of minutes. He learned hours by hunger and the ache that comes from being useful. The horn sang until Isla throttled it back so as not to cook the coil. In the ring of storm the walls softened from white rage to gray attention. The thunder that wasn't thunder shifted key, moved down a half step, steadied. News took a while to catch up. Cathedrals of lightning had schedules. Rivers argued with gravity stubbornly and then, grudgingly, stood down. But on the third day, Isla wrapped herself in a blanket, balanced a portable set on her knees, and found a scientist whose eyebrows Arlen recognized. The man's tired joy made him look younger. "We're seeing phase coherence return to several anomalies," he said. "I don't know what changed, and if someone does they should write a paper when they have finished, whatever this is. But the spiral is losing its edge. The energy looks like it's being redistributed." "Bled?" the anchor offered. "Conducted," the scientist said, and someone in the control room, off camera, laughed in relief. They took watches. Tane learned the pulse well enough to keep it while Arlen slept. His big hands looked delicate over the little bowls, and sometimes he sang under his breath, a low work song that made the water taste like old stories. Isla found harmonics in the horn that made the axis less hungry for the time Arlen could not give it. The three of them taught each other what their bodies already knew. Count with bone, curse when necessary, eat when you wouldn't think to. Ships came. First a research vessel that kept a respectful distance and asked questions in the tone people use near animals they suspect are smarter than they are. Then two tugs laden with buoys, paint peeling in a dignified way, crews that swore like poets. Tane hailed them, drew triangles on the air with his hand, set the first bell where the map's breathing told him to set it. The bells learned the count. The sea obliged. Days braided into a length that fit around a life. In the distance, the ring of storm settled like a tired muscle into something that still meant business but had no grudge. Arlen's hair took a pale streak like a chalk line drawn in a hurry. His hands trembled on deck and steadied below. He wrote in the ledger between Isla's code with a dull pencil, 7-3, sweep, rest. He added, find 5 more hands. He underlined the finding twice. On the 31st day of counting, a boat out of a country Arlen had never seen sent a diver who surfaced from the ring gasping and grinning. Your voice carried down the world, she said, wet eyelashes ridiculous with salt. Our blue hole sang back. On the 56th, a video arrived from the glacier. Someone had returned to the Moulin. The chest under ice sat there as before, open. But frost had grown along its carved bowls in filigree arcs that looked like writing. Wind moving across them made a faint tone in 7, then 3, as if the cold had learned the count. On the 89th, the great unmoving cyclone over the Atlantic began to wander like a bored guest and then forgot to be anything at all. On the 99th, a desert city staggered under a sudden rain that smelled like metal and old dust. Afterwards the air was clear as glass. On the 100th day, Arlen climbed back aboard with hands that belonged to a man who worked and a face that had learned new patience, and Isla made a cake from a box and a prayer. And Tane cried in a way that made no one move closer or away. They were not finished. A system like the Axis doesn't stop being itself just because it is behaving. It still needed counting. It needed people at the other gates to listen. The map still moved under Arlen's palm. The little embers at the ring's edge calmed, then flared, then calmed again like infants who would eventually learn to sleep. Letters arrived, ink blurred by weather and intent. We hear you in the Andes. Our cliff sings. The old stones in the desert stopped buzzing when we set bowls into the carved spirals and taught the children the count. A monastery built on the ribs of a mountain sent a diagram of bells hung at different heights with notation like music and like math. Arlen wrote back when he could. He began each reply with the same sentence, "You are not alone." He ended with the count. Between, he added his father's name and the truth that helped his hands be steadier. We sealed a thing once because we were tired. We opened it because we remembered it was ours to carry together. On an afternoon that had the audacity to be beautiful, a small boat nosed into the eye and cut her engine and drifted close. A woman with streaks of white in her hair and a scar on her palm lifted a hand in greeting. Arlen's breath forgot its next job. For a heartbeat he saw himself at 9 again, cold to the core and frightened into silence by a blue cathedral. "Hello, boy," she said, voice wrapped in weather. "You grew into the work." "Hello, Mum," he said, and all the things between them that had chosen not to be said for years chose to loosen. She came aboard. She held his hand over the bowls and then stepped back not because she could not bear it but because she could. "He thought the world needed one hero," she said softly, meaning his father without making him colder than he had to be. "He was wrong. It needs a choir." "We have a start," Arlen said. Tane banged a mug against the rail in amiable agreement. Isla, who had slept 2 hours in the last 20, lifted her chin from the coil of rope where she'd been using physics textbooks as a pillow and said, "Always wanted to be alto." They didn't finish that day, or that month, or that year. The work would be old by the time it was complete, and then it would begin again because that is the shape of things that respect time. But the catastrophe stopped introducing itself at every hour. The long, low thunder stayed, less threat than reminder. The world breathing under a hand that had learned to count kindly. Places recovered with the slow arrogance of survivors. Forests took back ground without saying "I told you so." Rivers apologized by being rivers. The aurora grew greedy for a season, spilled itself farther south than was polite, and then learned restraint again. Children at the desert gate asked 7 questions before breakfast and 3 after, because they had listened too well. The cliff circle on the island became a place where teenagers kissed and, when they pulled apart, found their mouths had learned to shape 7, 3, sweep without being asked. Arlen never became storybook holy. He swore when the bull's edge bit his scar. He burned rice twice in 1 week and would not lie about it. He wrote a manual on waterproof paper and hid jokes in the margins for the next hands to find on difficult days. If the horn goes flat, don't panic. It's a metaphor. Retune. He took the map out less often, because he no longer needed to see the glow to know where to set his hand. Once, when the sea lay glassy and the Axis's mind wandered contentedly through its own breathing, he slept on deck and dreamed of the woman with the kelp-pinned hair. "Well done," she said, not in the congratulating way but in the continue way. Her fingers, long and work-strong, touched his scar. Heat and cold agreed to be the same for an instant. "Tell them not to build statues," she added, sudden mischief in her mouth. "Or if they do, make them hollow so children can play inside." He woke and wrote it in the ledger. When at last they could leave the eye for stretches longer than a night, they did not leave it alone. The bells kept time, the horns spoke across fog, The buoys blinked 7, then 3, then the slow sweep in the dark, as if the sea had learned Morse from the sky. Boats came and went, researchers and fishermen, pilgrims and skeptics who stayed for the way the water settled under their feet like a beast that had decided not to roll. On a bright morning the color of forgiveness, Isla pointed the bow north and the hearthwind obliged with an enthusiasm that felt like gratitude. They went by the glacier. Arlen stood at the rim of the Moulin and listened. Far below, the chest sang back, not loud, but present. The cold was the clean kind. He pressed his palm to the blue and felt a small answering warmth, as if the world had stored a little of him where he had taken too much. Breath out, he said. Breath in. Tane came to stand beside him with 2 mugs steaming their agreement. We never really finish, he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a description of being alive. No, Arlen said. He took the mug and stood where the sky and the ice and the part of him that had wanted treasure all met and didn't argue. But we learned the count. And we teach it. They went back to sea. The hearthwind wrote a neat line over water that had found its sentence again. The bells in the distance phrased their little sermon. Isla fell asleep sitting up with a soldering iron in her hand, and Tane, who had a talent for writing with rope, tied a small loop around the iron so it would not roll away. Arlen spread the map one last time that day. It lay still, not because it had ceased to breathe, but because its breathing matched his. The ring at the edge pulsed only now and then, like old pain folding itself tidily into weather. At the center, the coal no longer burned. Instead, under the etched name axis of breath, someone, him, or his father, or the sea, had written a word in pencil. It was not a word the architects had used, but it was the right one for a world with plastic and violin teachers and men who made soup for exhausted strangers. The word was home. He closed the map. The sky remembered how to be blue without making a fuss. The world, not cured, not tamed, but accompanied, took another patient breath. And Arlen, who had traveled a long time to find a treasure misnamed a chest, set his hand to the work and kept the count, which is a kind of love that does not need an audience to be true.